We are paying for Ukraine's government, not just the war effort. We're paying for their whole government as Ukraine spends all of its own tax money on the war. And did you catch the part where they said that our money pays for Ukrainian educators and healthcare professionals? I mean, our country with our underfunded public school system and privatized nightmare of a healthcare system is paying for services for Ukrainian citizens that our own citizens don't even get with our tax money. But my bitterness about that aside, the reality of the situation with Ukraine unable to pay for government services is that without our money, there is a very real chance that the government of Ukraine is done.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. If you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 286th episode of your favorite podcast about Congress, Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is one that I have been wanting to give to you for a while. Because since February 2022, since Russian President Vladimir Putin invaded Russia's next-door neighbor, Ukraine, American taxpayers have donated so many billions of dollars to Ukraine to help them fight to keep their territory. And I have been extremely irritated in the year 2023 by how few hearings Congress has conducted to examine how our money is being used and what the Biden administration's goals are. But in November, we finally got the hearing that I've been looking for. In that hearing, high-ranking officials from the State Department testified because they are begging Congress for more money to keep the war going. And so they had to answer some key questions. And I have their answers for you today. I don't know how clarifying they're going to be, but I do feel like I got the gist of what they're trying to do. Because it is looking very likely that at some point in the early months of next year, that we are going to send additional tens of billions of our dollars to Ukraine. And I think we, at the very least, are owed an explanation of the motives and an outline of their plan. But before I get into all of that, this is going to be the last episode of 2023. And so I want to let you know that we have an opportunity to hang out in person if you are a middle American, but I don't have all the details yet. You're going to have to listen to my other podcast, We're Not Wrong, to get the actual details about this, but this is what I can tell you right now. The weekend before the Iowa primary, myself, Justin Robert Young, and Andrew Heaton are planning to do a live recording of our show, We're Not Wrong, in Des Moines, Iowa. At least I think we're planning to do it in Des Moines. I can tell you we're planning to go to Iowa. And I can tell you that I think we're looking at either January 13th or 14th, maybe even the 12th. I don't know. So this is what I'm saying. We're in a world of I don't know. But if you are interested in seeing that podcast recorded live and meeting myself and my co-hosts, we are coming to Iowa for the Iowa caucus. So please go and check out that podcast if you want more details about that, because I don't know if you're going to hear from me on Congressional Dish in enough time to get the actual details here. And I also want to remind you before we get started that this show, Congressional Dish, is listener supported and needs your support, because you're not going to hear any advertisements today or in any other Congressional Dish episode. You are my customer, not my product. But this show costs money to produce, and creating these episodes for you is my full-time job. And so to keep you as my customer and not my product, we operate on a version of the honor system. Call it the value for value model. As in, I create a valuable episode that teaches you, in this case, what the State Department is telling Congress, what our actual goals in Ukraine are, which is knowledge that most Americans won't have because most hearings are completely ignored in this country. And in return for that knowledge, you are expected to pay whatever you think is fair. It is, I give you value, you return the value in a financial form. And all of the options are on the Support the Show page on congressionaldish.com and in every episode's show notes, which are detailed and extensive lists of all my sources along with the timestamps for every sound clip, because I don't expect you to just trust me. I earn your trust by backing up everything I say. And that's important in episodes like this one, because I've been watching events in Ukraine for about 10 years now, kind of by accident. And there's some history that is very important to know that most Americans are unaware of, with, of course, the exception of long-term listeners to Congressional Dish. And for you, the wonderful soul who has been listening to this show and supporting it for the last decade, I do apologize that the next few minutes are going to be repetitive, but you know that the significance of the testimony will be lost on our newbies if we don't give them the backstory. And so, real quick as I can, let's take a look at how we ended up funding a full-blown war in Ukraine by zooming out and looking at the big picture. So, what I am quite certain at this point is going on in our world, what I've discovered by watching world leaders who discuss this openly with each other in congressional hearings and international meetings, is that the big picture goal of our foreign policy seems to be to get every country on earth to participate in one global economic system. And the first rules for the economy that they intend to be global were written immediately after World War II in the form of trade agreements, which always governed so much more than trade. And even though it took decades to get all three of these operational, there are now three global organizations at the center of the global financial system. One is the International Monetary Fund, one's the World Bank, and the one created most recently in the 1990s is the World Trade Organization. The idea behind this system, the good intentions behind the policy, is the idea that if the entire world is governed by these institutions, and if the whole world is financially connected, then there will be no reason for any countries to fight. But let's not take my word for this. Here's the guy who literally wrote the 500-page outline for what eventually became the World Trade Organization during negotiations that took place in Uruguay in 1994. The person you're about to hear is Arthur Dunkel, who is the Director General of the United Nations. And it's no exaggeration to say that he was one of the main creators of the economic system that is meant to be global.
I look back at the last 25 years. What did we have? We had two worlds, the so-called market economy world and the centrally planned world. The centrally planned world disappeared. One of the main challenges of the Uruguay round has been to create a worldwide system. I think we have to think of that. Secondly, why a worldwide system? Because basically I consider that if governments cooperate in the trade policy field, you reduce the risks of tension, political tension, and even worse than that.
So the idea is that if we can get every country in the world to join their system and just let these people rule the whole world, there will be no need for war. But there's been a consistent problem, which should seem kind of obvious, which is that some countries don't want to change their laws to become a so-called market economy. Some countries want to run their economies a different way. And so what has happened to the countries that want to try different approaches to their finances and trade agreements? What do they do about the administrations, elected and dictator ruled, who don't believe that the rules of the market economy are what's best for their citizens? Well, beginning not long after the end of World War II and the creation of the United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the countries with administrations that didn't want to follow the economic rules of the World Trade System, which prioritizes the rights of multinational companies and generally outlaws, to the extent possible, government operation of any service that can be done for a profit. Well, since the 1950s, countries that don't willfully go along with the market economy rules have often had their governments replaced via direct and indirect interference in their politics and election administration. And there is a pattern to these efforts which was brilliantly exhibited and explained in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine. If you want to jump deep down this rabbit hole and have one book really help you wrap your head around it. But the general pattern is that first, the World Trade System zealots generally try bribery to get the governments to change their laws in return for cash. And this is done, they can use private sector money or the World Bank, but very often it's the International Monetary Fund, which I think of as the loan shark of the system. Because the IMF will often loan countries cash with strings attached, which require the countries to change their economic laws as terms of the loan. And they call those strings reforms. But if that strategy doesn't work, the U.S. military and our partners have installed new governments in a lot of countries. New governments staffed with people who are willing to change their laws to match the market economy rules. And sometimes we have installed those new governments by force. So Iraq was an example of that. But what happened in Ukraine? That was a bit trickier. But basically, big picture, our military is the muscle for what I call the World Trade System. And lately, I've actually heard our military referred to quite often as the arsenal of democracy. And I'm just fascinated by that phrase, especially the use of the word democracy. That word democracy has been totally hijacked because our own country is clearly not a democracy. We are a country that has a legalized bribery system for our politicians running for office and which has two political parties that are huge and have almost completely rigged our election system in their own favors. Study after study has shown that our system is better described as an oligarchy at this point because our rulers listen to the rich, to their donors, and the opinion of the general public tends to affect their decisions almost not at all. This podcast has been documenting Congress passing law after law with corporate favors that the American people are not asking for, and we're getting into wars that the American people don't even understand. Those are not symptoms of a healthy democracy, and yet we are the arsenal of democracy, the muscle protecting democracy. No. Because many of our closest allies are even more blatantly not democracies. Saudi Arabia, full-blown kingdom. Israel is pretty damn close to being a theocracy. It's an openly religious government with laws that clearly favor members of one religion over all the others. But the tie that binds our country to them, it's not a political system that answers to the citizens with equality for all. It's not democracy. The tie that binds is economics. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia lets multinational companies that are on the stock market in the market economy. It allows those companies to come in, collect, sell, and profit from their fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia also allows the arsenal of democracy to put military bases on their land. And then there's Israel. Israel also partners with multinational corporations, allowing multinational corporations lately to sell and profit from the giant gas field off of their coastline. But its main tie to us is that it acts as a fighting arm of our arsenal of democracy. Since the 1990s, multinational companies represented by the U.S. and Israeli governments have been partners in inventing new tools of death, so many new weapons, and sophisticated surveillance technologies. And Israel allows the arsenal of democracy to have a military base on its land. And those are just two examples. And those countries are two of our closest allies. But they are not democracies that share our values, breaking with our values starting with Amendment number 1. The system we Americans are funding and enforcing and physically defending is not democracy. The system we fund, enforce, and defend is the global economic system, the market economy, the rules-based international order, capitalism. I call it the World Trade System. But for propaganda purposes, they say democracy. But once you replace the word democracy, every time you hear it out of an elite mouth, once you replace democracy with this concept of a global economy, whichever label you choose to use for it, but once you make that mental replacement, their goals and actions make so much more sense. And so, back to how governments that don't enthusiastically comply get sucked in. What generally happens first is that the International Monetary Fund loans struggling countries money. And, the European Union and other organizations do this too. But in general, in return for the loans, the IMF or the EU demand that the country changes its economic laws. And the changes they demand are ones that make the country more corporate friendly. And so in general, and I've witnessed this over and over again and documented it in real time on this podcast over the last decade, but there are 3 principles that can be found consistently in reform demands. One is that governments are told to remove rules and regulations standing in the way of the accumulation of profits by private businesses. Two, governments are often required to sell off assets that they own that corporations could be running for a profit. And three, governments are often required dramatically to cut back on funding of social programs for their citizens, especially ones like oil and gas subsidies that make energy more affordable for the citizens, but reduce the amount of money pocketed by corporate executives and shareholders. The system we fund, enforce, and defend is the market economy. The economy that funnels as much wealth as possible to the stock market. That's what we stand for in the world. Opening markets. Protecting the rights of multinational companies in those markets. Protecting their product transportation systems, their pipelines and shipping lanes. Using 750 military bases that are polka-dotted strategically in 80 or so market economies all over the world. That's the global game. Super simplified, obviously. But that's how I understand what's going on right now. That's the global game that I have watched Joe Biden, our current president and former vice president, play. And he's been doing this for his entire 50-year political career. He believes in this more than it seems like anything. Which brings me to Ukraine. Ukraine is Joe Biden's project, and it has been his project since the beginning. And the beginning was in 2014. When President Joe Biden was vice president and a little noticed bill became law. The new law gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Ukraine. And I wanted to know why, so I read the law and researched why it passed. And I discovered that members of the Obama administration, specifically Vice President Joe Biden, participated in a non-democratic regime change in Ukraine. Now, the details of how they did this are available all over the internet if you want to search for them. But the details of the actual regime change, they don't interest me all that much. But the general outline goes like this. In 2011 and 2012, Ukraine needed money, and the International Monetary Fund was willing to give Ukraine billions of dollars if Ukraine's government, headed by then President Viktor Yanukovych, would change Ukraine's economic laws to make the country more open to multinational corporations. Some of the demands made by the IMF were that, one, Ukraine should allow multinational banks to buy Ukrainian banks. Ukraine should limit the wages of government workers and cut government jobs. Ukraine was told to cut their health and education spending. Ukraine was told to eliminate subsidies that make gas prices more affordable for Ukrainian citizens. And Ukraine was told to privatize their gas industry. Those are not simple demands. Those are some pretty tough strings. But regardless, it appeared in 2013 that the Ukrainian government, headed by Viktor Yanukovych, was willing to meet those demands in return for those billions of dollars. And there were months-long negotiations detailing the terms of a trade agreement with the European Union. And multinational corporations, knowing that privatization of Ukrainian assets was a demand, they were lining up to get a piece of the Ukrainian pie. For example, Ukraine signed a 50-year, $10 billion fracking deal with Chevron just a few weeks before the EU deal was supposed to be signed. And Monsanto was expecting to make all kinds of money from growing food with their freaky seeds in Ukraine, because as explained in 2013 by the then ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, quote, Ukraine is one of the few countries that has almost perfect conditions for agriculture, unquote. However, 2 months before that trade agreement with the EU was to be signed, Russia threatened its next-door neighbor Ukraine with sanctions, with economic warfare if it signed the EU deal. And then, 1 week before Ukraine was supposed to sign the deal with the EU, Ukrainian President Yanukovych backed out of it. Instead of accepting the IMF money and integrating economically with the market system via the European Union trade agreement, Ukraine accepted the deal from Russia that included a $15 billion loan, a price cut for natural gas, and Russia was demanding no changes to Ukrainian laws. Basically, President Yanukovych was offered the choice between entering the global market economic system that we've been pushing since World War II with really tough strings attached, or partnering with their next-door neighbor with no strings and avoiding their sanctions. Ukraine's president chose a deal that he liked more with his neighbor, which in a sane world, you would think he would have the right to do. But in our actual world, that's when shit hit the fan. In December of 2013, a month after Ukraine backed out of its expected merge with Europe, anti-government protests happened in Ukraine. And you can understand why. People who wanted to partner with the EU had a good reason to protest. But there were some strange guests at those protests, including Republican Senator from the United States, John McCain of Arizona, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Rhode Island, and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs Victoria Nuland. And 1 week after returning from Ukraine, Senator John McCain spoke to one of those creepy world domination clubs. This one was the Atlantic Council. And this is what he said to his fellow economic marketeers.
If Ukraine's political crisis persists or deepens, which is a real possibility, we must support creative Ukrainian efforts to resolve it. Senator Murphy and I heard a few such ideas last weekend, from holding early elections, as the opposition is now demanding, to the institution of a technocratic government with a mandate to make the difficult reforms required for Ukraine's long-term economic health and sustainable development. Decisions such as these are for Ukrainians to make, no one else, and if they request our assistance, we should provide it where possible. Finally, we must encourage the European Union and the IMF to keep their doors open to Ukraine. Ultimately, the support of both institutions is indispensable for Ukraine's future, and eventually, a Ukrainian president, either this one or a future one, will be prepared to accept the fundamental choices facing the country, which is this. While there are real short-term costs to the political and economic reforms required for IMF assistance and EU integration, and while President Putin will likely add to these costs by retaliating against Ukraine's economy, the long-term benefits for Ukraine in taking these tough steps are far greater and almost limitless. This decision cannot be borne by one person alone in Ukraine, nor should it be. It must be shared, both the risks and the rewards, by all Ukrainians, especially the opposition and business elite. It must also be shared by the EU, the IMF, and the United States. All of us in the West should be prepared to help Ukraine, financially and otherwise, to overcome the short-term pain that reforms will require and Russia may inflict.
And Russia has inflicted some pain, all right. But at this point, exactly 10 years ago, Russia was expecting to be partnered economically with the Ukrainian government. There was no war on the table. Because all of this talk about IMF reforms, that deal was rejected. It was over. In order for that to happen, it would take a new Ukrainian government to even make that a possibility. And here's some evidence that a new Ukrainian government was created, at least in significant part, by the United States government. So a few months after that speech, in early February 2014, a phone call between the then Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who was the lady who was in Ukraine meeting with the political opponents of the Ukrainian president over, the Christmas period. And she was actually hanging out, passing out cookies at the protests with Senator John McCain and Chris Murphy. It was very weird. So she's doing that in December, and 2 months later, a conversation is recorded and leaked between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. And of course, I have the tape of the call for you. I think this is some of the strongest evidence about our involvement in all of this. And I know that longtime Congressional Dish listeners have heard this call 1,000 times, but it's a classic for a reason. And one of the stars of this phone call, our then ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, he is now a high-ranking official in the Biden administration, and he's one of the witnesses who you're going to hear testify today. And in case you're wondering, Victoria Nuland is also now a high-ranking official in the State Department. Every American involved in this 2014 phone call has since been promoted. Now, in this call, the State Department's Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, are discussing which of three people should be put in charge of the next Ukrainian government. The options they'll discuss are Vitaly Klitschko, who ended up becoming the mayor of Ukraine's capital city, Kiev, and he remains the mayor today. They also will discuss Ola Tonybuk, who is the leader of an anti-communism, anti-Russia political party in Ukraine. And they'll talk about Arseny Yatsenyuk, nicknamed Yats, who is the person who would become Ukraine's prime minister 21 days later.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
And they got some help in their plan from the very top of the U.S. government.
We want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
And less than 3 weeks later, the government of Ukraine was overthrown. Now, again, the details of how the overthrow happened don't interest me all that much. There were protests, they were violent, President Yanukovych fled the country, and the Ukrainian parliament voted to replace him. And at the end of that process, the person that the Obama and Biden administration had chosen to run the Ukrainian economy weeks earlier in a phone call they thought was private, well, their chosen one, Yats, did become the installed prime minister of Ukraine, and he kept that job for over 2 years. And during his over 2 years in power, the guy Yats signed the trade agreement with the EU, took money from the loan sharks at the IMF, and Yats brags on his personal website now that he, quote, initiated large-scale national reforms, ensured budget austerity, and severe financial discipline, unquote. He was exactly what the Obama-Biden administration wanted in charge, and Russia was pissed. And so the same day that Yats became prime minister, Russian troops began arriving in the peninsula that hangs off the southern coast of Ukraine called Crimea, a peninsula that was Russian until 1954, when Russia gave it to Ukraine. But more importantly, Crimea is a peninsula that houses a major Russian military base and is home to their Black Sea Fleet. And after seeing the government that had just agreed to partner with them replaced somehow, Russia's President Putin decided to take control of Crimea. And along with that, their military base and a shale formation full of untapped natural gas. And at this point, this is when the new American law giving Ukraine hundreds of millions of dollars, almost all of it for weapons, landed on my desk. And for 8 years, from 2014 to 2022, when damn near no one in the United States was paying attention, billions of our tax dollars went to pay for the creation and arming of a Ukrainian military, which for 8 years waged a civil war against its own citizens on the Russian side of the country who wanted to economically partner with Russia, not the EU, and who had disapproved of their democracy getting set aside in what sure looked like a coup to them. And since 2014, we've been fighting a proxy war in Ukraine with, at first, Russia low-key arming and funding their side and the United States low-key funding the government that Biden helped install. All of this started in 2014, not 2022. And our current president was at the center of it. And in the early years, there was a chance to avoid the war that has killed so many people since Russia full-blown invaded and tried to overthrow Ukraine's government in 2022. Because during those early years, an agreement was created and was supposed to end the civil war. It's known as the Minsk Agreement. In 2015, Germany and France brokered a peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, which was endorsed unanimously by the United Nations. The agreement centered around the idea that the Donbas region, which is a thick sliver of land on the eastern side of Ukraine, it's an area that's next door to Russia and full of Russian-speaking people. That region was supposed to be granted a special independent status by Ukraine's new government, as in it would be a part of Ukraine officially, but it would have some independence, kind of like a state does here in the United States. The deal then required both Ukraine and Russia to withdraw their forces at the same time from the Donbas region, and then after that, the two largest cities in the region would hold local elections to determine their own leaders. But right away, the implementing law that the Ukrainian version of Congress passed contained some poison pills. Two of the most poisonous pills were, one, the pill that required Ukrainians fighting on the side of Russia, the ones who were defending the democratically elected government that was overthrown, well, they would be required to surrender to Ukrainian troops before Ukraine would uphold their end of the deal and grant the region any kind of independence. And then the second pill is that it required the Donbas cities to let the new Ukrainian government administer their local elections, which many saw as a setting of the stage for a good rigging. So that was 2015. Deal didn't work out. And now let's fast forward to 2019, when a comedian named Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine. And once Zelensky became president, he declared that Ukraine was not, in fact, bound by the Minsk agreement and would not grant independent-ish status to the Donbas region. And then, the next year in 2020, Joe Biden, the guy who got the coup deeds to stick, was promoted to president of the United States. And within days of Joe Biden's administration taking power, President Putin of Russia started swarming troops toward the Ukrainian border. And 1 year and 1 month after Biden's inauguration, Putin invaded Ukraine and started a full-blown war, which started with an attempt to take over the country, which failed pretty early in 2022, and which has since devolved into a stalemate. Right now, Russia still controls Crimea, which it has controlled with really no pushback from the locals since 2014. But now Russia also controls the Donbas region, which the world had unanimously expected to be granted some independence. And Russia also has control of some territory in between those spots that they just straight up stole. And Russia is right now occupying about 20% of the land that was known as Ukraine before the coup in 2014. And that map really hasn't changed at all for a year. I think it is very accurate to say that the Ukraine war is a stalemate. And again, let's not take my word for it. In the November 1st issue of The Economist, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army admitted that 5 months into a Ukrainian counteroffensive that was expected to win the war and drive the Russians out of Ukraine, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian army said that his troops had advanced by less than 11 miles since the counteroffensive against Russia began early last summer. He said the war is in a stalemate, his words, and he would know. But despite that reality, proven by the assessment of the highest-ranking Ukrainian military commanders and maps, some of which I've put in the show notes for you, but with that being the current situation, a stalemate, as acknowledged by those who are being honest, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a hearing on November 8th to hear the Biden administration's plea for approximately $50 billion more in a supplemental funding request to be sent to continue the fight in the Ukraine war. And for context, that amount of money could buy us approximately 2 big digs, which is the nickname for the Transportation Transformation Project in Boston, Massachusetts, which buried a hideous freeway under downtown Boston, built the iconic Zakim Bridge, and built undersea tunnels that connected South Boston to East Boston. So we could, with that amount of money, transform 2 major American cities for the better, or we could pay for the Ukraine war. And the Biden State Department wants to send our money to Ukraine. And so here are the Biden administration's explanations for why a war that has been stalled for a year should continue to be funded. Here's James O'Brien. He is the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, which, by the way, is the job that Victoria Nuland had during the 2014 Ukrainian coup.
Ukraine has won back 50% of the territory Russia took since February of 22. The second piece that's important, Putin is playing a waiting game, like many Muscovite rulers before him. So it's difficult to get a decisive battle. So what we need is what's in the supplemental, that is the ability to fight this fight over some time. And we do see real success.
And that's indicative of what you're going to hear a lot of today. The rosiest picture possible, right up to the point of being deceptive. Because by saying that Ukraine has won back 50% of the territory Russia took since February 2022, well, that makes it sound to anyone who isn't paying close attention like Ukraine is making substantial progress, if not winning. But he left out the context that all of those gains happened in 2022, and we're about to watch the ball drop into 2024. And the picture of success is also canceled out over and over again in the hearing once the witnesses got into the details. So here's James O'Brien again, our Assistant Secretary of State, followed by Aaron McKee, who is the Assistant Administrator for Europe and Eurasia at the United States Agency for International Development, otherwise known as USAID.
The direct budget support that we provide to Ukraine enables Ukraine to put all of its tax dollars to support the war. Ukraine pays for about 60% of the costs of this war right now. The direct budget support pays for hundreds of thousands of educators, first responders, firefighters, and healthcare professionals to work within Ukraine.
At this time, there is no funding left for direct budget support. Without further appropriations, the government of Ukraine would need to use emergency measures such as printing money or not paying critical salaries, which could lead to hyperinflation and severely damage the war effort. USAID has also exhausted all of its supplemental humanitarian assistance funds. Additional funding is critical in the face of what remains an enormous need. If Congress does not approve supplemental funding, our partner organizations in Ukraine would have to either reduce the number of people getting this humanitarian assistance by up to 75% or suspend our humanitarian programs entirely.
We are paying for Ukraine's government, not just the war effort. We're paying for their whole government as Ukraine spends all of its own tax money on the war. And did you catch the part where they said that our money pays for Ukrainian educators and healthcare professionals? I mean, our country, with our underfunded public school system and privatized nightmare of a healthcare system, is paying for services for Ukrainian citizens that our own citizens don't even get with our tax money. But my bitterness about that aside, the reality of the situation with Ukraine unable to pay for government services is that without our money, there is a very real chance that the government of Ukraine is done. Here's Aaron McKee of USAID speaking to Senator Chris Coons of Delaware.
Right now, Ukraine is able to spend all of their national budget in the fight. They are paying their soldiers' salaries. They are, dedicated to defeating Putin on the front lines. That means they don't have any resources to take care of their people and govern, which is as vital to keep up the unity of purpose and the resilience that we've seen from the Ukrainian people, because they're all in, both on the civilian and the military side. And so the types of services that would be suspended are first responders who rush into the building and save lives. Medical care to make sure that inoculations stay up so that the Ukrainian population stays healthy, particularly children, routine immunizations. We heard reports of polio outbreaks and some other concerns during the early days of the mass emigration of folks fleeing the conflict. We also are supporting teachers and continuing education so that they don't lose a generation as a result of Putin's attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, so that the kids can stay in school and that those families are there.
Am I correct that the direct budget support requested gradually goes down over the next year as the economy becomes more vibrant and we assess Ukraine is able to generate more revenue?
Correct. The direct budget support and their fiscal stability is also vital for the IMF program and other donors stepping in. Our leadership in this space, and yes, we were first, unlocked the other support that we've seen mobilized from the EU, other donors, as well as boosting the confidence in the multilaterals to be able to contribute to Ukraine's economic stability, which is as vital as winning the war. If their economy collapses, Putin will have won.
And what happens if the Ukrainian economy doesn't improve during a war? We're told that our funding of the Ukrainian government will go down because things are going to improve. But what if they don't? There's a war. Well, that question wasn't asked. And also, did you catch it? Did you catch it? Did you catch the IMF program? Because there are always strings.
USAID also looks to the future, to building resilient infrastructure and institutions that will support Ukraine's path towards European Union integration. For decades, USAID has buttressed Ukraine's progress towards transparent, inclusive, and accountable governance. The United States continues to help Ukraine carry out judicial reform, institutionalize transparent financial systems, and respond to the people of Ukraine's zero tolerance for corruption.
We are paying for the Ukrainian government and demanding changes to it.
They have not skipped a beat in advancing the reform agenda. The EU report just came out this morning, and both Ukraine and Moldova and a variety of other countries received support for continuing and opening chapters of accession talks. That's because our support to strengthening and deepening the institutions fighting corruption in Ukraine have received the top priority from the president. They had to pass and meet conditionality that we put on our direct budget support, and did so without blinking. So while they're fighting a war and fighting for their survival, they are 100% dedicated to ensuring that the political economy model that they inherited during the Soviet Union is dismantled, which reflects the will of the Ukrainian people.
So, clearly, the global game of assimilation into the world trade system is still being played in Ukraine, despite it being in the middle of an existential war. And it turns out that the International Monetary Fund, the loan shark of the system, had to change its own laws to continue playing with Ukraine. Because until recently, the IMF rules didn't allow it to lend money to countries at war. But it used what the IMF described as alternative instruments. So, emergency programs pulled out of the IMF's ass to lend Ukraine $2.7 billion in 2022. But you know what's wild about that? Ukraine in 2022 was also required to pay back the IMF $2.4 billion from pre-war loans. And so the IMF gave, lent $2.7 billion and took $2.4 billion. And so I really struggle to see how that's all that helpful, especially when we know that there are always strings attached. Like, can you imagine lending a desperate friend money, a friend who's in the hospital on life support with a few limbs missing, and putting your money so generously in his hand? And then when he falls back to sleep, walking over to his wallet, which you see sitting on a chair, and taking out almost the same amount of money that you just gave him because you had lent him money before he got hit by the vodka delivery truck. What kind of help is that? But because Ukraine did pay back almost the same amount of money that it was lent, the so generous IMF agreed to give Ukraine more money. But because the IMF still wasn't allowed to fund a country at war, this time, the IMF made significant changes to its policy in March of 2023, changes that will permanently allow the IMF to insert itself into war funding situations in other countries going forward. And Ukraine is being considered the IMF's pilot program for giving money or lending money to countries at war. The IMF's Ukraine pilot program provided $15.6 billion to Ukraine to be paid back starting in 4 years, and they promised but didn't actually give an additional $100 billion. That $100 billion will be dependent upon whether or not Ukraine changes its laws, whether it enacts the IMF reforms that are being demanded. And so what are those reforms? Well, by reading the IMF documents, I discovered that Ukraine is being told to 1, change their government structure so that the Ministry of Finance is in charge of reconstruction instead of the Ministry of Infrastructure. Ukraine is also being told to lower corporate taxes and change their labor laws. Ukraine is also being told to eliminate regulations that prevent fucking around with Ukraine's currency. Ukraine is also being told to sell off land to the private sector in the year 2024. And Ukraine is being told to take steps that will eventually lead to Ukraine selling off its gas pipelines. And even if Ukraine does every one of those things, the IMF is still not offering to suspend or cancel any of Ukraine's previous debts, which means that just like with the first batch of loans in 2022, Ukraine over the next 4 years will end up repaying the IMF almost as much as it receives, along with 6% interest. Which sounds like a crap deal to me. The US and the EU have loaned Ukraine money with 0% interest. But it is worth noting that the European Union is demanding changes to Ukraine's judicial system, specifically changes to how judges are selected. And the EU is demanding that Ukraine enact a new law on the media, which President Zelensky has already started doing. Because in May of this year, Zelensky presented and the parliament passed a new law that requires media outlets to give the government information about their owners and gives the Ukrainian government the power to shut down media outlets after they receive multiple violation notices. Put another way, the European Union is requiring Ukraine to enact a censorship law. and the European Union welcomed the passing of the first part of it. And so if we put ourselves in Ukraine's shoes, you really want the United States money, because even though our government is undoubtedly on board with the reforms being demanded, our loans have often required 0% in interest, and we are just straight up gifting billions of dollars in weapons, which is not so great for U.S. taxpayers, but it's definitely great for Ukraine and for multinational corporations, because our government is setting the stage for the private sector to get in on the Ukrainian riches. Here's Erin McKee of USAID.
To respond to Russia's weaponization of hunger, USAID launched the Agriculture Resilience Initiative to keep farmers afloat. USAID also works very closely with the private sector to improve Ukraine's energy security and transform Ukraine's energy sector into a modern engine of growth. Side by side with our agriculture and energy efforts is USAID's support to small and medium enterprises, helping Ukraine increase jobs and generate revenue.
And for more on the energy sector efforts in particular, here's Jeffrey Pyatt. You remember him. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine who was caught picking the guy who would enact reforms in a new Ukrainian government 3 weeks before a new Ukrainian government was switcherooed into power in 2014. Well, now he's been promoted to our Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, and he told Congress,
Ukraine is not a charity case. In economic and development terms, it's an opportunity. Developing that opportunity depends on restoring a level of peace. But as we look to the future, you're going to have a Europe which has decoupled from Russian energy supplies, which means that there's a hole of about 130 BCM per year in energy supply that Europe is going to have to fill. Over the short term, some of that is American LNG, but that's a very expensive option. Ukraine has fantastic resources on wind, on solar, on biomass. It has Europe's second largest civil nuclear industry. It has developed and has demonstrated an extraordinary technological acuity. Just look at how clever Ukrainian soldiers have been in the application of satellites, of drone technology. These are all the skill sets that Ukraine will need to prosper as a member of the European Union. My colleague, Assistant Administrator McKee, referred to the statement which European President von der Leyen delivered today, welcoming the significant progress that Ukraine has made on its reforms, and her and the Commission's determination to move ahead with Ukraine's accession to the European Union. And I would say, as somebody who served as an American ambassador in the EU for 6 years, what Ukraine represents, a demographically young population, a population which is fantastically committed to the values of the European Union. Ukraine is the only place in the world where people have fought and died under the flag of the EU for the values that are represented in the European constitutions. So I think the investments and the leadership that Secretary Pritzker is providing to help our companies and companies around the world begin to make plans for the day after, and to work with the Ukrainians to keep pushing forward the reforms which are fundamental to creating the environment where American energy companies, renewable energy companies, can come into Ukraine, where we can use Ukraine to help to fill the huge challenges that our global supply chain faces. Ukraine, in the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the center of Soviet metallurgy, the center of Soviet petrochemicals industries. All of those latent skills are still there. You talked about nuclear. Ukraine has a company in Kharkiv, Turboatom, which is one of the few facilities in all of Europe that has the industrial capacity to produce the large steel enclosures that are part of building modern nuclear reactors. So I applaud your focus on this, and I know I speak for all three of us in how systematically we're focused on trying to lay the foundation for that better future that the Ukrainian people so richly deserve.
Such a rosy picture of future riches for multinational companies. So many opportunities to funnel profits into the pockets of lazy rich people who don't work and make all their money through the stock market. So many educated humans who can become corporate drones for the market in Ukraine. You know, their vision for Ukraine is quite the corporate utopia. But then there's the pesky details again.
For Ukraine, this coming winter promises to be even more challenging than the last. Ukraine's generation capacity has degraded about 50% since the start of the war. Ukrainian energy workers have labored day and night, often under fire, to repair, restore, and harden grid and generation facilities, often by cannibalizing parts from elsewhere. But most spare parts by now have been consumed, and Russia has recently resumed its bombardment of power plants and refineries, including just this morning in eastern Ukraine. So I would point out that the greatest threat to the energy grid today are these Shahed drones, and which Russia is now beginning to industrialize the production of those. We can talk about that in a classified setting. But there is a direct Iran-Russia nexus in the attacks on Ukraine's energy system. The World Bank has estimated that after last winter, Ukraine needed at least $411 billion to rebuild its infrastructure. That was 8 months ago. Every day, that number grows. Electricity grid damage alone amounted to $10 billion in 2022. Ukraine's economic future depends on investment by the private sector, and energy is key to unlocking that industrial recovery.
And the private sector certainly has been investing.
After the full-scale invasion, U.S. LNG producers stepped up to surge supplies to Europe as our allies turned away from Russia as an energy source. Since 2022, U.S. exporters have supplied the EU with approximately 90 million tons of LNG, 3 times as much as the next largest supplier. Last year, 70% of U.S. LNG exports went to Europe. Europe's shift away from Russian energy has happened much faster than predicted and marks a permanent shift in the international energy map. And one of the real success stories amid the tragedy of this war is that Europe has turned decisively away from its dependence up until 2022 on Russian gas in particular. I see that as a permanent change in the landscape. It's reflected in the billions of dollars that European countries have invested in regasification facilities. It's reflected in the contracts that are being signed with American LNG producers. And it's also reflected in Europe's renewed and doubled commitment to accelerating the pace of its energy transition. So ironically, Putin's weaponization of his energy resource has induced Europe to break its vulnerability there. And I think that is a permanent change in the landscape that is also a positive benefit for American energy producers and our leadership on the energy transition.
Corporations that make money from collecting and burning fossil fuel gases, because he clearly has a boner for all of the gas contracts despite his lip service being paid to an energy transition. But the corporations that make money from fossil fuel gas are lining up to cash in before the bombs even stop falling.
American energy companies like Halliburton, GE, and EQT have been active partners in this effort, providing vital equipment to Ukraine and actively exploring future commercial opportunities. We're working together to build a better future for and with Ukraine, modern, cleaner, and with a more decentralized power sector that is fully integrated with Europe, even serving as a power exporter to the rest of the European Union.
Ukraine, with its perfect agricultural land and plenty of fossil fuel riches, is the site of a metaphorical gold rush, if we can only get fucking Putin out of the way. But once we do, the Biden administration intends for only Team World Trade System to have a chance to get rich. Here's Senator Pete Ricketts of Nebraska speaking to Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, James O'Brien. And the abbreviation PRC stands for People's Republic of China.
Do you think we should condition U.S. aid to prevent U.S. tax dollars from supporting PRC-owned or controlled entities from providing the reconstruction?
Senator, we do. That's why it's so important to have the supplemental so that we remain in the game and can set the conditions that make it impossible for opaque, illegitimate contractors like the Chinese to enter. And I know my colleagues can speak at some length about how in energy, telecoms, and other sectors, we do exactly that. But if we're not there, then we can't provide the guarantees you want.
And that is a part of what is clearly a bigger picture goal, a global game goal, which is to permanently harm the countries that are not only unwilling to change their laws and become subservient market economies, unwilling to sell off their citizens' riches to the multinational corporations, but are also setting up international partnerships which challenge the market economy system. The countries that are starting to set up a system that competes with the system that our current rulers have dedicated their entire political lives to making the one system to rule us all. For a decade, Ukraine has been at war. And the entire time, that war has been a proxy war between the World Trade System, so with the United States, the European Union, our partners on one side, and the new system, which I sometimes call BRICS, but the new system, which has Russia and China and the countries that are siding with them. Zooming out and looking at the Ukraine war from that lens, here's Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien.
Russia's losing its lucrative markets. That's what got it rich enough to afford this war. It's losing out in the sectors of innovation that are going to drive economic development in the future. So we look at this and say, does it put pressure on Putin to get to the table? Well, yes, it does. It's going to take a little time. He started the war with $640 billion in a rainy day fund. By the start of this year, despite record profits last year, he was down around 580. We immobilized 300 of that, and he spent down further from there. So that gives him a year, 2 years maybe of run room on that rainy day fund that all came from selling oil and gas. So that's gone. The second thing is that we don't see Russia able to play in the sectors that are going to drive innovation and economic growth in the future, the areas of quantum mechanics, artificial intelligence, the energy transition, including the new nuclear technologies that are coming on board. And Senator Risch, your work on this I really appreciate, because Russia entangles countries in these long-term networks of corruption with generation-long Rosatom contracts. We're now competing for those again and taking those sectors away from Russia. That changes the long-term prospect from what it was. The result of all this is we anticipate that Russia's GDP is going to be at least 20% smaller by 2030 than it would be if Putin had not started this war. So it's a long-term strategic loss for him, and it creates a great opportunity for us in a number of important sectors.
Thank you.
So the longer the war goes on, they think they just need a few more years, the more it hurts Russia. And I'd love to play a clip for you here where a senator asks about, how many Ukrainian soldiers and citizens are expected to die if this goes on for a few more years. But I don't have that for you because no one asked for that estimate. Instead, this was the Biden administration's stance on Ukrainian lives. Here's Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien.
Right now, Ukrainians are willing to do this job because it's in their territory. If we abandon them, then somebody else is going to have to do this job later, and it's likely to be us. So I'd rather confront Russia and its destabilizing attitudes right here, right now, and we can finish the job with the supplemental that we've proposed for your consideration.
Finish the job. This war isn't about Ukrainian borders, because if it were, then once the new borders are drawn, probably right along the current stalemate lines, as unsatisfying as that likely outcome feels. But once that happens, then for most of us, the job would be over, right? There would be peace if that job were achieved. But according to the Biden administration, that's not the job. The job is the global game. The job is weakening competitors to the market economy system that they intend to be global. That's the job. Which is why they want Ukrainians to keep fighting, and they're okay with Ukrainians dying. Because if the war stops now, the job isn't done, even if there's peace. And Americans will have to fight Russia eventually someday, because Russia would still be able to challenge the dominance of the market economy system. Like I said before, they talk about this openly with each other in the halls of power. They're all on the same page. They want Ukrainians to keep fighting the war. They want the war to continue because they want more time to bleed Russia's finances. And ideally, they want the companies, the multinational companies that they work for, to begin making money in Ukraine in the meantime. Here's Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien.
There are about $2.2 billion to go to both the energy supply and to the economic activity that's needed for Ukraine to begin to repair its access to the outside world. That's also important to us. When Russia invaded Ukraine, grain prices went up 6 times in many places around the world because Ukraine is an incredibly important part of the global grain trade. The work that AID does to help Ukrainian farmers get their products to market. In the supplemental, the $100 million that is for demining will help farmers get their product to market. All of that directly benefits the markets in which our consumers are a part. So if we do all that, then Ukraine has, as I mentioned in my statement, if we can get them to about pre-war export levels, that's an extra $6 billion a year in tax revenue just from the exports, as well as what the industries pay and what happens around the society. Now, Secretary Pritzker, and she should come and testify this herself, she's doing an outstanding job at building a strategy that lets us focus our efforts in key places so that Ukraine's economy will begin to work and contribute to the global economy even while this war is going on.
They want the war to continue and for the multinationals to be able to start to cash in the meantime. And while they say that $2.2 billion will be spent on the agricultural and energy sectors, the big money, the real big money, well, it's another industry that's going to get that.
The military assistance in the supplemental is about $45 billion. That goes to acquire American equipment that Ukraine will then use to pay for American service people to support Ukraine, and to pay other countries to acquire American equipment after they provide equipment to Ukraine.
And that last part about how we pay other countries to acquire American equipment after they provide equipment to Ukraine, that makes me question these numbers.
The next question is who's with us? We have more than 40 countries. They provide much more assistance to Ukraine than we do. It's about $91 billion to our $70 billion so far. They've hosted 4.5 million Ukrainian refugees at a cost of around $18 billion. They are proposing another $50 billion in assistance just from the European Union.
And I have to wonder how much of that's a circle jerk, where other countries are donating weapons to Ukraine, and on paper it looks like that's from them, but they're actually weapons that we paid for. Does this make it look on paper like we are paying for a smaller percentage of the war effort than we actually are? I have no proof of that, but I have to wonder. But it's beside the point. The point is that the Biden administration is begging Congress for $50 billion or so for Ukraine, and $45 billion of that is for weapons, for tools that cause death. The money that supports Ukraine's teachers and firefighters and doctors and nurses, the money that we supply that pays for their government, for the citizens of Ukraine, that's just a small fraction of the money. They want to continue the war. And the questions from most of the senators was about how to do so, with the exception of one senator who I am very grateful for. One senator who asked the question that I was begging for. Here's Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, speaking to Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien, and this is their entire exchange.
As Harvard's Graham Allison points out, if Putin is forced to choose between humiliating defeat on the one hand and escalating the level of destruction, there's every reason to believe he chooses the latter. There's a great deal of evidence that the war in Ukraine has come to a stalemate. Even Ukraine's commander-in-chief of the armed services has admitted as much. In Graham Allison's view, the Ukraine war has escalated far enough to see how bad things would become if we end up in a world where nuclear weapons are used. Allison believes that where we are now, both for Putin's Russia and for the Biden-led U.S. and the Western alliance, it's time to search for an off-ramp for all of the parties. What is being done at the State Department to search for an off-ramp?
Thank you, Senator. A few points. I can speak to the foreign policy implications. My belief is if we don't stand with Ukraine now, we'll be spending much more on defense in the future. And much of this supplemental goes to reinvest in the United States. So far from rot and ruin, we're actually shoring up the foundations in our energy sector, as Assistant Secretary Pyatt.
So your argument is that war and funding war around the world is good for our armaments industry?
I'm saying this supplemental is good for our economy.
For the armaments industry. So really it's a justification of war. To me, that's sort of reprehensible. The idea that, and this is coming from my side as well, oh, glory be, the war is really really not that bad. Broken windows are not that bad because we pay people to fix them. Broken countries are not so bad because, hey, look, the armaments industry is going to get billions of dollars out of this. Yeah. I think that's a terrible argument. I wish y'all would say maybe there's go back to your freedom argument or something. But the idea that you're going to enrich the armaments manufacturers, I think, is reprehensible.
Well, Senator, I'm not making the argument war is good. I'm making the argument in this case war is necessary.
And that we can make a little profit on the side. It's not so bad since the armaments guys will make a lot of profit on this, right?
No, Senator, I think you're proposing a kind of false choice that I either have to say that or say nothing. What I'm saying is that our economy rests on a foundation of innovation, and in this supplemental, we're investing in our energy sector, as you just heard.
The money's borrowed. We're borrowing the money. We don't have it. We don't have a pot of money. So what you're arguing is, in essence, that we borrow the money from China, we send it to Ukraine, Ukraine sends it back to buy arms from us, and that's a win-win. How do we win when we're borrowing money to pay people? See, this is this sort of false sort of argument that, look, we'll create 5 jobs for every dollar we spend, but we're borrowing the money. It doesn't make any sense. It's coming from somewhere where it would be in a productive use to where it's into the use of basically fomenting a war and continuing a war.
No, that's not the choice in front of us, Senator, and I'm sorry that you feel that that's the way you want to frame it. The choice in front of us is, do we invest in the capacities that allow this war to be won? Those include capacities in energy, in defense, in IT.
In the original question, let's get away from funding the armaments people. I'm not for that. But the original question is, what are you doing to develop an off-ramp? When I listen to your presentations, it sounds like the Department of War. I don't hear the Department of Diplomacy in front of me. Where are the diplomats? Is anybody talking about negotiation?
Yeah.
Do you really believe that that Ukraine's going to push Russia out of Ukraine? They're going to push them out of Crimea, push them out of the east, and that Zelensky's position, we will not negotiate till they're gone from Ukraine, is viable, and that there's not going to have to be some negotiation beforehand? If you believe that, though, the meat grinder continues, and Ukraine will be an utter destruction, and tens of thousands of more people will die if there is no negotiation. You would think that as a superpower, we would be involved somewhat with encouraging negotiation, but I've heard nothing from you and nothing from anyone in your administration, frankly, that talks about negotiating.
So, well, Senator, then I hope you would, sit down and talk with me about what we're doing in this regard. Here, I'll give you a little sense of it. All wars end with a negotiation. We've made clear we'll do that with Ukraine, not over Ukraine's head. It takes 2 parties to negotiate the end of a war. President Putin is not serious about negotiating the end of the war. He has said he wants to wait and see what happens in November 24. So we're preparing for that eventuality so we can have a negotiation that will actually stick, as opposed to the track record of broken agreements that President Putin has made with a whole range of his neighbors up until now. So that's successful diplomacy, not mere diplomacy.
There are actually some who say we're back to about where we started as far as negotiating, and tens of thousands of people have died on both sides, and we haven't been successful. But I still hear only war, and I don't hear diplomacy.
No, but I think what we're looking at is successful diplomacy. I just spent last weekend with 66 countries talking about the basis of a successful peace in Ukraine. Russia didn't show up. That, again, is the problem. You don't have a willing partner on the other side. So simply saying that there must be talks you're asking for a monologue, not diplomacy.
And if that were true, that would be a compelling argument. But just because Russia didn't show up to that meeting, that doesn't mean that Russia has been unwilling to talk the entire time. In fact, very early in the war, in April of 2022, Russia offered a peace deal to Ukraine in return for Ukraine staying out of NATO, the military alliance dating back to World War II that is now clearly an anti-Russia alliance, and which has expanded right up to Russia's border despite promises made at the end of the Cold War that expansion that far east wouldn't happen. But Ukraine didn't take the deal. And there are a lot of theories about why Ukraine didn't take the deal, including because they were following the advice from former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who told the Ukrainians not to take the deal. But the Ukrainians had their reasons for not taking the deal. The point is, though, that Russia has been willing to talk since almost the beginning of the war. And also, about 2 weeks ago, journalist Seymour Hersh reported that there are private peace talks happening right now between high-ranking generals in both Russia and Ukraine, including the same Ukrainian general who said in that interview in The Economist in November that the war was in a stalemate. Because the generals are the ones who are sending thousands of young people to die. And the dead people are harder to dismiss when you see them, when you know them. when you care. The idea that diplomacy is impossible simply isn't true. And the fact that the idea is being presented to Congress by the part of the Biden administration that's in charge of diplomacy, not war fighting, these are our diplomats. The fact that they're the ones saying this is extremely disturbing to me. But our diplomats clearly want the war to continue. And the vast majority of senators, with the notable exception of Rand Paul, seem to be on board. But they don't know how to sell the idea to us peasants during an election year. So here's Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, a man who has never seen a war that he's not an enthusiastic cheerleader for. And here he is speaking to Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien.
Now, I understand, and this is not critical, I understand, I agree with all the things about, we can't allow borders to be changed unilaterally, and we have to stand with our allies. I'm not diminishing any of those things. But these arguments those arguments are too vague. They make sense here, but I'm just telling you they're too vague. And I think that they're also, this notion of we need to do whatever it takes for however long it takes is also misguided. Not because that's not necessarily what we need to do, but because that's not going to be enough for people that are asking these questions. So I would just say, if you had an opportunity, any of you three or all you three, to talk to someone that came up to me a week ago and said, why are we still putting all this money in Ukraine? I hate Putin. I hate what he's done. But we've got all these other things domestically and in other parts of the world that are more important, including China and now what's happening in the Middle East. How are we going to be spending $60 billion every 6 months? For how long, given the debt that we already have? What would you say to them, and how would you explain to them that this fits into our national interest in that perspective I've just outlined?
That's really well framed, Senator. So I'll do my best here. I think the first thing I'd say is you got to shore up your own base. If we're going to confront the China over the next decades, it's 1.4 billion people that's looking to write the rules that the world economy will run on. We go at them with a coalition of 50-odd countries. Europe is about 600 to 700 million of that. We're 350 million. With that, already, we're set to compete really effectively. Ukraine, though, is a challenge by Putin trying to fray that foundation. So we have to shore that up if we're going to have the heft to compete with China over time. The battle over Ukraine also allows us to reinvigorate our own industrial base. We're creating new energy technologies and putting them in place around the world. We're building new defense technologies, the work that's being done in IT. All of that's included in this supplemental, and that's going to make us better able to defend Taiwan, to work in the South China Sea than we have otherwise. The final point I'd make is this is the wrong time to walk away, because Ukraine's winning. It's already taken back half the territory Putin seized since February 22. It's opened up the Black Sea grain lanes that Putin tried to shut down in July. Did that mostly with its own creativity around a whole set of interesting drones and other technologies that are going to contribute to our security as Ukraine gets closer to NATO. So those are all reasons you don't walk away when you're partway through the job.
This is all about the global game. And it's so revealing that when asked how Rubio is supposed to explain to his peasants why we should sacrifice enough money that could be used to transform 2 American cities in order to prolong the war in Ukraine, the first thing that comes out of O'Brien's head is, we need to confront China? Now, if you don't know about the global game, that makes no sense. But we do know about it, and it makes perfect sense, because this war isn't about Ukraine's borders or the defeat of some Hitler-like threat. Here's Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon speaking to Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien.
I'm really struck by the parallel to the journey of Chamberlain to Munich to say, okay, Hitler, you can take a third of Czechoslovakia, and then he declared peace in our time under the assumption that somehow this would not whet Hitler's appetite. Did Chamberlain's strategy work?
No.
Will the strategy now of us bailing on Ukraine to appease Putin work?
No, it'll invite more aggression.
Ugh, that is just propaganda. When they are real talking, the reasons they give for all of this are China, the world economy, our industrial base's opportunities. And this has gone on for so long. And as I keep seeing these wars happen, I just don't know if the world economy and our industrial base's opportunities, I just don't know if that's worth it. I don't think I care if there are 2 international economic systems, or 3 or 4, or if every country gets to have the freedom to make trade deals on its own. And I don't think I care if Europe buys fossil fuels from Russia or from Chevron. I don't know that their true goals are worth all the sacrifices in lives and money that we regular people from around the world are being asked to make. Because at the end of this, let's say we accomplish the real job and get the global economic system, the whole world in the market economy. If we get that, it's going to be run by these people. And I don't trust them. And so why are we using so much of our tax money and sacrificing so many lives to help them rule the world? Because the Ukraine war, and I am struggling to find exact numbers, but as of a week ago, Canadian news reports are saying that at least 100,000 human beings have died in this war. And this is just one war of so many that have been fought for this since the end of World War II. And what are we doing it for? I know what the people in Congress, these DC power-hungry monsters, I get their perspective. But what about us? What are the regular people? What do we get out of this? Why are we sacrificing so that multinational corporations can have unlimited access to the world's resources and an unlimited number of peasants to work for them? Is this all so that they can collect profit and pass the money out to shareholders? Is that it? Is this all to pass money out to the people around the world who have enough money to bet on these companies in the stock market? Because that's what the market economy is. A very simplified explanation of it. That's what it is. As sophisticated as economists and Milton Friedman disciples want to make it sound, the market economy is privatization of resources and the profits flowing through the market, the stock market. It's all about the market. Well, I personally am not willing to die for their market. And so I'm not sure that I support asking others to die for that goal is something I'm going to do. That goal, the more I learn about this and the more I see how many people are dying for it, it's feeling hollow to me. Because this whole thing isn't fighting for freedom. Freedom would be letting countries run their own economies and partner with their neighbors if they want to. And if we had done that, had Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych been allowed to just sign that trade agreement with Russia, and had we just stayed the hell out of it, would there even be a war right now? Because if the majority of the Ukrainian people didn't like that, at the time they had a democracy. They could have voted Yanukovych out in their next election and voted for someone who would go back to pursuing a trade agreement with the European Union instead. But instead, Vice President Joe Biden and the people he has since promoted decided to help overthrow that government and force Ukraine to partner with our side. And Russia reacted very violently. This has just been a cycle of wrongs that have produced no rights. But we are where we are. And Ukraine's government really does seem fucked if we don't give them our money. Because while I don't want any more humans to die for a stalemate that is being prolonged on purpose, I also don't want Ukrainians to have no way to pay their teachers and their doctors and their firefighters. I don't want these citizens to suffer any more than they already have. And under the leadership of then Vice President Joe Biden, who we have since promoted, we helped to break their government in 2014. And so I think we kind of bought it. And current President Joe Biden sure does seem to think so. But I don't know how to fund the essential services without also funding the goals of the Biden administration, especially seeing how few senators were interested in doing that. And I don't really know what to do. I don't know what to suggest. I'm so tired of this. I have no solutions. I'm just so tired. And so now at least you know what I know about why we're probably going to send 50 billion more of our dollars, most of that in weapons, to Ukraine. And as unsatisfying as it is, I just have to let you do with that information whatever you want to do. Because I don't know what to do. So I want to give you a heads up that I don't know when I'm going to produce the next episode of Congressional Dish. All I can tell you for sure is that this is definitely going to be the last episode for December, and I don't know what January is going to bring or what kind of episodes I'm going to have for you. I do think you might want to prepare yourself for some experimental formats. But my plan for right now is that for the first time in over 11 years, I'm going to take the Christmas and New Year's holidays off. For 2 weeks, I am not going to be reading any bills or watching any hearings or paying any attention to this Congress because, to be completely honest with you, this Congress has been the absolute worst and I can't stand having to pay attention to it right now. There are enormously consequential world events happening, and this Congress has proven itself to be incapable of rationally navigating our country through these moments. I'm finding myself angry and scared, and I feel very powerless to change any of it, and I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping. In fact, I've been having a lot of trouble sleeping since October 7th. What's been happening is I've been waking up most nights around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm finding myself incapable of getting back to sleep because I can't turn off my thoughts about Israel and Gaza. Because while I chose to focus on Ukraine in this episode, one thing that I do feel irresponsible if I fail to mention is that the bill that's being written that would provide the funding that's needed in Ukraine, that bill would also provide $14 billion for Israel, specifically for Israel's military, the Israeli Defense Forces, which for over 2 months has responded to the indefensible and wrong murders and kidnapping of about 1,200 Israelis. But they've responded to that by murdering, as of this recording, more than 18 times that many people. So many of those people, children. On top of that, the Israeli government has prevented the people of Gaza, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with October 7th, from getting food, water, medicine. And on top of that, most of the residents in Gaza can't currently live in their homes. And it snows in the winter in Gaza. But the reason these people can't live in their homes is because the Israeli government told the people of Gaza to move from the north to the south to be safe. And 1 million people did. They moved out of their homes and onto the streets. And now Israel is bombing the south. The people of Gaza have nowhere to go. They're literally caged. They're not allowed to leave. And this whole thing is horrific. And since October 7th, I've been, in addition to producing the episodes of Congressional Dish that you've heard, I've also been listening to very long books and podcasts explaining every detail of the history of Israel, because I know Congress is going to change our laws. They're finishing up the defense authorization as I speak. And I know I need to produce an episode about this. I hear everyone who has asked. But I'm going to make sure that I know exactly what I'm talking about before I do this. That said, I have been doing this studying, and I do think I know what I'm talking about. So if you want a preview of how I feel about things, I don't think that my attitude, even in these comments, is really hiding anything. But I also certainly haven't been shy about my feelings on We're Not Wrong, especially the December 14th episode, if you want to hear it. But that war, if you can call a situation where one side has all the power and the other side literally has none, if you can call that a war. But since I don't know what else to call it, this war has been consuming my thoughts. And I've been spending many hours trying to learn as much as I can to understand all the nuances. And so I just finished the 25-hour book, Enemies and Neighbors by Ian Black, which I chose because the reviews said it did a good job of explaining both sides. And I think it did. And I'm also more than halfway through about 20 hours of the Martyr Made podcast episode about the history of Zionism, which goes really far out of its way to look at each event with an empathetic view of both sides. You may have heard of this because this was the podcast that Dave Smith recommended to Joe Rogan, and Dave is totally right. It's really good. But I want to make sure that when I produce an episode about Israel and Gaza on Congressional Dish, I want to make sure that I fairly describe the history. Because I know my bias. I am biased in favor of Jewish people. 100%. I have no close Arab or Palestinian friends or family members, and I never have. But I've had plenty of close Jewish friends. And now I have family members who are Jewish, and I love them so much. I've loved adding Jewish traditions to our family. I've loved being welcomed into so many Jewish celebrations over the course of my lifetime. And I lived in Germany. I have cried in the Dachau concentration camp. I've gone to the Holocaust memorial museums. I know anti-Semitism is real and scary, and it threatens people who I love. I love Jewish people. And Jewish people are not Israel. Israel is a government. And it's a government that I have some problems with because, and I don't want to get into all the details of this just yet, but just, my personal issues with working on this episode is that I feel like my American education about Israel left out a lot of important details, like all the details that make Israel look kind of bad. I'm finding myself processing a lot of feelings about being deceived as an American child. Again! And not just as a child, as an American adult. Because I didn't even question what I thought about Israel until it bombed the shit out of Gaza in 2014. I thought I was horrified by Israel's use of violence back then. But that was nothing compared to what's happening right now. But I know that if there are this many things that I didn't know about Israel's history and what the Palestinians have been through, then there is probably a lot that you, if you were also educated in American schools, might not know as well. And I think we need to know the truth about the situation in order to determine what role we want to play in it as Americans. Because Israel, by using this much violence and cutting off the population of Gaza from life essentials, and doing so flying symbols of the Jewish religion on their flag, Israel, the government, is making my friends and family members less safe. And Israel, our military partner, is making Americans less safe as well. Because the world is enraged, and they are enraged at us. And I've seen this before. I was 19 when 9/11 happened. 9/11 was my intro to adulthood. And 9/11 was retaliation for things our government did in the Middle East since before I was even born. There's a cycle of violence in the Middle East that our government is fueling, and we will not be immune to the cycle when it comes back around. I watch international news all the time, and countries around the world are airing conversations on their news programs calling us complicit. Check out my Twitter feed. I'm posting some of them there. But complicit is the word being used. Now, that sentiment has been expressed since October 8th in Middle Eastern media. But now even our allies are discussing on their news programs the ways that Americans are, quote, complicit in everything Israel is doing to Gaza. The world is blaming us for this. And you know what? Rightfully so as of last week. Because President Joe Biden just sent 14,000 tank shells to Israel, which, if you're not familiar with a tank shell, those are giant bullets and literal bombs. And President Biden did so in a way that circumvented congressional approval. He basically abused his emergency powers to send more weapons to Israel, a government that has proven that it has more than enough to kill tens of thousands of people already. And perhaps, if we didn't send that government free bombs, they'd be a bit more careful with the ones they have. But when something is unlimited, let it rain. And that's what's happening. Bombs are raining down on Gaza nonstop, every day. And our government might not be able to stop Israel's government from doing whatever they want to do, but Joe Biden, in our names, just made us complicit by sending more bombs that will be used to kill more people after more than 15,000 people had already been killed at the time that he approved that order. We will pay for this. Now, obviously with tax money. But Joe Biden's choice to send bullets and bombs stamped with Made in America on them ensures that whether it's our military members overseas or innocent Americans living their lives somewhere vulnerable to terrorism, we will be affected by this cycle of violence, which we are fueling. And I know I have not given my consent. My members of Congress have not given their consent to add fuel to the fires in Gaza, at least not yet. President Joe Biden made that choice, a matter of war, by himself. But that's not how our system is supposed to work. But once again, Congress is nowhere to be found. Not that this Congress as a whole has acted a single time in a way that shows empathy towards the Palestinians in the last 2 months. This Congress, the same week that the death toll in Gaza hit 10,000, this Congress censured Rashida Tlaib. They punished the only Palestinian member of Congress for saying, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," which, taken on its face, on the actual words used, and in good faith, is a statement for Palestinian freedom, not for Jewish death as it's been twisted by those who voted to punish the only Palestinian in Congress for her words. They punished a congresswoman for calling for freedom. They punished her for speech. They punished her for a pursuit of freedom for people. That feels so un-American to me. And it feels like it goes against everything we stand for. And the fact that it was done to a congresswoman standing alone on the side of the powerless, I'm just so ashamed of this Congress because they're doing all of this in our names. I mean, this Congress isn't even examining what is happening to the people of Gaza. Forget about trying to stop the death and suffering. This Congress has had 0 hearings demanding answers from the Biden administration about what their support in our names for the Israeli military is for. There has been no pushback against his decision to send bombs without congressional approval. Congress has had 0 hearings to discuss what the goal of the Biden administration is when they send bombs, and if that goal is shared by their Israeli government partners. Because the Biden administration keeps saying that the goal is a 2-state solution. So, that basically is legalized segregation with one religious government in Israel and one Palestinian government next door. 2 separate actual countries. But the Israeli government under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu is saying he won't allow that. So what the hell are we doing there? If we have different goals, why are we sending them bombs? And also, Congress has not held hearings about Israel's plan for Gaza after they destroy Gaza's housing, power plants, hospitals, schools, farms. What exactly is the plan for governing that not a country with no infrastructure left? None of that is being examined by the people who are expected to fund it and approve it. It's like they're not even interested. Support for Israel appears to be on autopilot. And the reason I bring this up is that the bill that would give money to Ukraine, the fight about that bill, the reason it's not law yet is because they are fighting about whether or not Republicans will be able to attach anti-immigrant dingleberries to the bill and which dingleberries they'll get. Israel's $14 billion of our tax money, that doesn't even seem up for debate. That's the uncontroversial part of that bill, unless we make it controversial. But so far, the global protests and the freeways that have been shut down and the congressional offices that have been sat in and the phone calls we've made, they don't seem to be making much difference. The indifference to the suffering in Gaza is unbearable. I just can't handle the juxtaposition of the indifference that I'm witnessing in Congress, which has the power to change this situation in so many ways. The juxtaposition between that indifference and the pictures and videos that I'm seeing every day from Gaza. I can't handle that there are little kids having limbs amputated without anesthesia because Israel won't allow enough medicine into Gaza from Israel or even Egypt. Israel is controlling the border with Egypt and not letting stuff in. And now, because food is being withheld as well, even the lucky duckies who have survived this far are starting to starve. It's such a nightmare, and it goes beyond the bombings. Israel can hunt Hamas fighters while still allowing food into the country, or the not a country, because that's the whole point. Palestine is not a country. It is controlled by Israel in every meaningful way. But they can hunt Hamas fighters while allowing farms to exist. I can't stand it. This is a nightmare, and it's not ending, and it's all by choice. This isn't some tragic natural disaster. Humans are choosing to do this. Humans we are giving weapons to. And so with thoughts like these, I can't sleep. And it's gotten to the point that I need to be selfish and turn this all off for the holidays. Because I'm burning out. I'm getting to the point that I don't know what to do. And so I don't know when I'm going to have the next episode for you. I'm going to need some time. Because not only is this Congress just exhausting to focus on for a living, but there's also a structural problem that I'm having with Congressional Dish, because it's been 11 years and I still don't know how to physically do this show. You know, I'm sure this is TMI. I've been going on for a minute now, and I know that some people don't give a shit, but if you're still here, I might as well tell you that learning about such huge topics, these deep dives, every one of these episodes are just intense. I feel like I have to learn and explain so much, which is definitely a part of the fun, but it's also just heavy and intense. And I guess I've known this, but it's still amazing that Congress legislates everything. It's so important. And we have entrusted it to just the worst people. It's a lot. I mean, just looking back on this year, I spent the holidays last year, so exactly a year ago, working on what is currently listed as the #1 most valuable episode of Congressional Dish as determined by our executive producers, which was called Contriving January 6th. And for that episode, I listened to all of the January 6th committee hearings, over 20 hours of them. And I cut all the fat and I stitched the testimony together by subject. And I did all that in 2 weeks over the holidays. And since then, I've learned and created individual audio documentaries about the ticketing industry. And I read the NDAA and studied our government's funding of Ecuador. And I did a few episodes on social media censorship and Taiwan and global reserve currencies and digital currencies, our organ transplant network, and literal aliens, along with other topics. You know, those are some intense subjects to do crash courses on in 1 year. And then on top of that, I'm also watching Congress and trying to document what's happening in real time. So we had a debt ceiling crisis. I did an episode on the censure of Adam Schiff. And, you know, since then, they've actually censured 2 more people. So Rashida Tlaib for her words. And they censured the dude from New York. His name is escaping me right now. But they censured him for pulling a fire alarm. So there's that. Didn't make any episodes about that, but it happened. We also had the Speaker of the House fired. That was insane. I also had to tell you about the plan, which is still very much possible, to steal all of Russia's money that's sitting in the banks. And then, of course, I also had to give you an episode about the literal con man in the House of Representatives and the person who's been indicted for being a foreign agent in the Senate. The foreign agent, by the way, Bob Menendez, is still there because nothing makes sense in this Congress. And even though I've done all those episodes, I still feel like I'm missing a lot of what happens in real time. You know, it's almost like I'm doing 2 podcasts here. One deep diving into subjects Congress is working on, and one about what Congress is doing right now. And I feel like I have to do both, but I don't know how to do both. It's a balance that I just haven't figured out. But then again, there's good reason for that. Because right now, Congress, you know, they haven't done it as of this recording, but by New Year's Day, they will pass a 3,000-page defense authorization into law. And it's been written and available to read for maybe a week. And I've already done some word searches in the text, and the word Ukraine is on at least 35 pages, and the word Israel is on 70 pages. And so someone should read those pages, and that someone shall be me. But that's not quick or easy work. And a lot of the times, you know, I'll read these bills. I don't think this will be the case with the NDAA, but there is a lot of times that I will look into a bill and I will take the time to read it, and it takes hours. And then I don't make an episode out of it because there's not much to report after I dive into these things. I've read so many bills and didn't make episodes out of them because they turned out to be essentially nothing burgers, which is work for nothing, really. And so that's why I started focusing on reading laws only, but this Congress has only passed 22 laws. The NDAA will be number 23. And most of those laws are not that interesting. The most interesting one was the one about the organ transplant network, and so I learned all about it and produced that episode. But on top of the things that become law, there have also been straight crazy bills and amendments introduced and attempted to get into law, and so many of those attempts are crazy and gross and definitely fascinating. And I do feel like the people that are trying to get crazy things into law should be exposed. And right now, those things have no role in this podcast. You know, in a way, this is a very privileged bitch session because my problem is that there is too much content for me to handle. There are too many fascinating things about this dumpster fire of a Congress. And so I guess it's a good thing that I never have any problems finding topics. But so many of the topics are such deep rabbit holes. I have to learn about so many different things because this Congress is in charge of so many important things. And to be really honest with you, while I'm TMIing anyway, I'm having motivation issues. And I know one of the main causes. The funding trend for this show this year is affecting me. Specifically, we celebrated hitting 1,000 paid patrons in May. I was very happy about that. But as of this recording, we have 993 paid patrons. In the last 7 months, we lost 7 patrons. And I try really hard not to compare my success with others because there are podcasts, I was listening to Robbie and Brianna on Rising this morning, talking about how they routinely get 1 million downloads. But I do what all the therapists say to do and compete only with myself. But even when I remind myself that close to 1,000 patrons plus everyone who pays with other methods is still great, I should be proud of that. But seeing the support go down, because it's not just Patreon that's gone down, but that's the most visible number. But seeing the support go down, it makes me feel like I'm doing this all wrong. Because good shows grow, right? And this one isn't. And so I just need to step back and figure out how to do this. Because what I'm doing isn't working. And I know it's not because I'm lazy or because I'm over learning things about Congress. I'm actually still a freak and excited to read the NDAA because I always find fascinating things in there that tell me what's really going on in the world. I like the work, but I don't know. I can't keep doing it like this. And I don't really know what that means, which is why I need some time to figure it out. What I can tell you, though, is I will be working in January, but I'm giving myself permission to stop producing episodes for a while. I mean, maybe. I don't know. But I'm going to give myself permission to take time to learn and to speak when I'm ready. Because I need to sift through 3,000 pages of the NDAA. And I want to fully finish learning about Israel and Palestine's history. Because there's just no way with that topic that every person who hears that episode will agree with my assessments. But at the very least, the facts will not be in question. And as I work on those deep dives, we also have 2 government funding crises on the calendar. One on January 19th and another, a bigger one, on February 2nd. If I was the groundhog, I would just stay underground. And government funding is just as much of a mess today as it was the last time I talked about it because Congress is leaving Washington, D.C. for the holidays as I speak without finishing or really working on any of the funding bills. And Congress isn't scheduled to return until January 9th. I know the rest of us are going back to work on Monday the 2nd, or Tuesday the 2nd, whatever. Most of us are working that week, but Congress, nope, they don't come back until the 9th. And that will give them 10 days, including the weekend, to finish 4 out of the 12 government funding bills. That's what's due on the 19th. None of which have made it past the first draft stage. And so I have zero hope that they will get that done on time. And so, as usual, here I am looking at January. I have a deep dive to work on and a crazy current event to cover at the same time. And that January, quite frankly, sounds awful. I'm dreading it. And seeing support drop this year, that does not motivate me at all. The thing that does motivate me to even think about producing episodes in January or February are the people who are supporting this show. If you are someone who is still supporting the show, please know that once again, you are the reason Congressional Dish still exists, because your support is so valuable to me. And when I ask myself, what am I doing this for? It's you. I've been struggling today, and so I checked my Venmo. I actually sent a few of you some messages. But doing that made me feel supported. It made me feel less alone. I'm doing this for you. I want to do this for you. And I know when you pay me that this work has been valuable for you. It really does keep me going. And so thank you for supporting the work even when the opinion doesn't match yours. And thank you especially if you are paying by check or PayPal or Zelle or any other way on a monthly or weekly basis, because you're the reason that I feel like I can take a break this year for the first time in 11 years. I do know that that isn't healthy to not take the holidays off for 11 years. But if I relied only on Patreon, which is a per episode payment model, I'd never get to take a break. And that burnout would risk the existence of this show. You know, the balance of this community, everybody funding it in a different way and different amounts, it's so beautiful. I'm so proud of it. And if it didn't matter to you, if your payments weren't there to prove to me that this show is valuable for you, I'd be more seriously thinking about an off-ramp right now, because I really hate this Congress. And if you're not paying for the show, real talk, I wish you would, because Congressional Dish is not free. It's just not a show that sells your time and the trust we've built with each other to companies. Your trust is too valuable to me to sell. And I do genuinely question, is this podcast not valuable to you? Because you would think that the more value I produce, I've now done 286 episodes, you would think that support would increase with more episodes and more value being created via this podcast in the world. But it's not increasing, it's decreasing and has been for months. And so I'm being told by your actions, or lack of action in this case, that this show has no value to you. You know, how else am I supposed to receive that message when I see the downloads and don't see corresponding payments? Because that's how I'm receiving that message, that this show is not valuable for you. And I want you to really think about this for a second. You know, does this show provide value to you? Can you think of any ways that it's been valuable to you? You know, have you ever shared a fact that you heard on this show, confident in repeating it because you know I provided my source in the show notes? Have you ever learned something that you didn't know before that helped you understand a current event better when it happened? Does that knowledge have value? Because if the answer is yes, and yet your contribution total to Congressional Dish remains zero, what is that? Why do you think that this work should be done without pay? Are you someone that doesn't tip at restaurants? Because we all know we can get away without tipping. Tipping isn't required. But as a former waitress, I know for a fact that very few people walk out without tipping. And so how is this different? You know, other than as a waitress, I was delivering you a drink and a burger and you would give me a few bucks. But what is it that makes thousands of people refuse to pay a few bucks for weeks worth of research and organization into a full-blown audio documentary every 2 weeks? Why does this work not get paid by thousands of people who I know are probably tipping their waitresses? You know, why are you telling me, as a former waitress, that handing you a burger was more valuable work than producing these episodes? And if that's not the message that you think I should be receiving, you can send a different message in whatever amount you consider fair for the value you receive using any of the options on the support the show page on congressionaldish.com. And please do. Because I know that with the way I have funded this show, taking a break is going to cost me a lot of money. But I'm at the point where I have to do it because the existence of the show is in danger if I continue with this level of burnout. And by the way, while we're talking about funding the show, because I did get a question about this week, whenever you contribute to Congressional Dish, we keep track of your contributions. And every payment goes towards an executive producer credit, which costs a $535 cumulative dollars. So when you hit that and you become an executive producer, that allows you to put your name, your vouch, basically, on your favorite episode as an executive producer. And your vouch moves that episode up the most valuable episodes list, which as I decide how I'm going to change this show, I am definitely looking at that list and doing so often. That list is not only super helpful for new listeners, but it's also really impactful for me to know what episodes you value and which ones you don't. And so, with that, for the last time in 2023, I'd like to thank our new executive producers, including Peter Healy, who actually hit 2 executive producer credits, and he sent in a message which just said, for Congressional Dish 281 on the Organ Transplant Network, holy fucking hell, what a shit show. I don't have a lot of hope in the private sector will save the day, but damn, something has to change. Can't be much worse. FYI, I still have the organ donor heart on my license and will continue to keep it there. Great episode. Thank you very much. And that episode, that one's fascinating to me because that one got almost no love to the point that I re-recorded it. And yet it is moving up quickly in the most valuable episodes list. And so thank you so much for supporting it. That is also one of my favorite episodes. I feel like it's so important and covered by no one. Although apparently John Oliver did recently do an episode about the organ transplant network. And my husband now thinks that there has to be someone on the writing team for John Oliver's show that listens to Congressional Dish, because it is not the first time that I've produced an episode and a month or two later, he does an episode on the same topic. So I don't personally really believe that. I think it's fun to believe. I think it's sweet of my husband to believe. But yeah, other than myself and John Oliver, I don't know many people talking about how broken that network is. So yeah, thanks for supporting that episode. I hope people will listen to it more often because of your EP credit. And then for his second EP credit, he put it on Congressional Dish number 269, the NDAA 2023 Plan Ecuador episode. And he said, I think this episode is a really good broad look at the generally asinine mess that wasting our tax money is. I also really liked big digs as a unit of measurement because it's something tangible you can relate all those abstract and ludicrous numbers to. You also sifted through a shitty fucking scanned PDF and not a proper searchable one. Respect and thank you for your service. Signed, Peter Healy. And thank you for acknowledging that. Yeah, that one sucked even more than others because they didn't give us a real PDF. Like, oh, I hate this Congress. That wasn't even this Congress. My God. But yeah, that is the type of stuff that I do for you. So thank you for acknowledging the value that it brings to you. And then we also have one more executive producer credit going on episode 201. WTF is the Federal Reserve. And this one is for Kyle Richert. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yeah, Kyle, that episode is a perfect example of one of the episodes that was so intimidating for me. The Federal Reserve, the topic, even just examining what it is, was mind-blowing. It got into what is money, when it turns out money is nothing. Our money is based on nothing, which is terrifying. And I've actually listened to that episode a few times just to remind myself of what the situation is. But that's just, it's a perfect example of an episode that it just felt really big and hard to wrap my head around and then have to explain in simple terms. And so I love seeing executive producers add their name to that episode because that was a really hard thing to do. And it just lets me know that that episode is valuable for you. And it was really hard. It was a lot of work. I guess I just am trying to say it means a lot to me when the hard episodes are appreciated. So yeah, thank you for putting your name on that. And then he also said, keep up the great work. I love the show as well as We're Not Wrong. Send my best regards to Andrew and Justin, as well as the unsung hero of the early days of the show, Husband Joe. Loyal dishhead, Kyle Richert. I like dishhead. That's funny. And Joe is not just the unsung hero of the early days of the show. He is the hero every day on the show because the person who supports me the most is Joe. Every time I'm thinking of stopping doing this, he's the one that calms me down. He's the one that encourages me to take the break. He's the one who, you know, lets me know that I don't have to do this if I don't want to. And knowing that I have that freedom actually helps me keep doing the show in a weird way because I know this is voluntary for me. And so when I actually am given the freedom by my husband to quit doing the show, and then I think about my life without it, I don't know what else I would do that would connect me with such a beautiful community of mature people who give a damn. I don't know what else I would do that would be as interesting. Yeah, I don't know what else I would want to do. I do love this show. I don't know how to do it. So yeah, thanks for supporting me and Congressional Dish. I wish I was ending this year on a higher note, but it's been a fucked up year in every way. So I'm hoping 2024 will be better. I don't know. So what I'm wishing for you is a relaxing holiday. I hope you're giving yourself the time and space you need as I give myself the time and space I need. Yeah, these are crazy times. And so I wish you the happiest of holidays. I wish you safety and health. And I'll be back. Happy holidays. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.